My name is Eli Lehrer, and I'm here with Addison Garner, events manager for the R Street Institute. And we're here talking with Andy Serkis about both himself, his work, and his new film, Animal Farm. So Addison, let me hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Serkis. We're very honored and we're very excited to screen your film. I'm going to start with some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, hit me with them.
All right. What's your favorite city to spend time in?
Florence in Italy.
Wonderful. What's your favorite location you've shot in?
New Zealand.
Of course. Okay. Do you like early morning shoots or night shoots?
Both.
All right. What's your favorite comfort movie that you're not in?
My favorite comfort movie is Apocalypse Now.
All right. Okay. If you weren't an actor,
Comfort
what would
movie.
you be doing?
If I wasn't here now, what would I be doing?
If you weren't acting.
Oh, if I wasn't acting, I would probably be climbing mountains.
Wonderful. Okay. What's your favorite film? I know that's a big question. If you want to break it down, that's fine too.
Wow, my favorite film. Okay, that's a difficult one. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Wonderful. Okay. What is your favorite line of dialogue you've delivered?
Let me see. It's mine, my own, my precious.
Understandable. Um, who is your favorite misunderstood character in film or literature?
Oh, my favorite, most misunderstood character. Probably Frankenstein, I guess.
Nice. Okay. What is your dream project or story you'd love to adapt in the future?
Well, I that's a really good question. There are a number of them. But I'd say the next one is a film called The Free India Legion, which is about Indian soldiers in the Second World War being forced to work for a British imperialist army and then ending up on the side of the Nazis,
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's awesome.
captured by them, and then formed a Free India Legion.
Wow. All right. Which of your characters would win in a fight?
That's a tough one. I think it would be, yeah. I mean, King Kong would probably be in there somewhere, just purely because of his size and his ability to rage. But
More
then
than the Witch
Gollum's
King?
like a bag of cats, and so could probably scratch his way out of any situation, you know?
Okay. Okay. So not the elf in Arthur Christmas.
Not the Elkanah Well, he's quite tough as well.
All right. Eli, did you have anything to add to rapid fire?
Um, Not right now.
Okay.
Let's dive into Animal Farm.
All
Uh,
Let's do
right.
it.
so we collected questions from some people who will be in the audience, as well as questions, and modified them and played with them. So I'm going to be mentioning some other people, and these are just people in the audience. Some of them are journalists and so forth. Stephanie Slade of Reason Magazine and Stacy Ruminak both raised questions, versions of this. Some viewers read the film as anti-capitalist as much as anti-communist. This is very consistent with the novel, which was, of course, written by somebody who described himself as a socialist. You've said in other interviews that you don't want it tied to any one system. So what's the underlying failure mode you think the film is actually sort of diagnosing and talking about?
Ultimately, it's talking about authoritarianism and fake news and the inability of leadership to listen to their people. That's really what it's about. It's across the world there are despots who are not listening any longer to the people they represent, and that is fundamentally what this film is about. But also underlying that is the idea that um, we history keeps repeating itself, and it asks the question, why is it that we always make the same mistakes?
Got it. So we had two people in the audience, Mahor Haq and Stephen Kent, who asked why release the film now and why release it in terms of today's populist movement. Were you doing this sort of with current politics in particular, or more to the recurring pattern in which movements promise dignity, then centralize power and make dissent costly or even impossible?
So we started making this film back in 2012, and I did not expect it to take this long to make and release. So it wasn't with today's any political individuals in mind. It was about it. But what was beginning to become apparent was that leadership was enticed into it further, and with the use of internet and social media and the way that they could talk directly to people, controlling and taste making using social media and fake news. So it was not really about again, we wanted to make it contemporary so that young, inquiring minds would find it entertaining as well as engaging. And that was very important to us. We didn't want it to be about totalitarian Russia in the 40s and the failure of the communist system. Because we felt it needed to be more current, and these were who our targets would be. But of course, this was long before anybody who actually is in power right now it was even thought about
Awesome.
in
I
many
know that a
respects.
lot of people would be interested in, I guess it would be in a farm pun, how the sausage is made. What elements made this project take so long?
It's interesting. There's a sort of an idea about Orwell from a studio perspective, and we wanted to make this a four-quadrant movie, i.e., we wanted to make it for a family film that young people could sit with and watch with their parents and with their grandparents. So that was a very, very clear motive of ours. We didn't want it to be too heavy, and we went down the route of it being much darker when we started writing the script. But we realized we wanted to have this debate between young people, the next generation, and their parents and grandparents. So once we decide we originally it was going to be a motion captured film, so or performance capture as we call it, using the technology that I've been associated with all these years and creating it in a live action environment. But it just seemed that George Orwell's fairy tale, as he calls it, just might become too dark that it was palatable for a big audience. So animation was starting to go in adult animation, and the whole notion of what animation is has started to become more acceptable as something that a cross generational audience could watch. So we took our time to decide exactly how we would design the characters, what they would look like, what our story was, who are, again, when we were writing it, we had to think, Orwell doesn't write a protagonist, and in a film you sort of have to have a protagonist. So and the pigs are off-screen characters in the book. You hear the news disseminated from them, but you don't spend that much time with them. It's really on the receiving end of the animals. But I wondered what it would be like to put a conflicted young piglet of the next generation who'd lived after the rebellion and lived with seeing the failure of Animal Farm, what that would be like for him to, on the outset, navigating between the two different styles of leadership as populist leader and a very sort of more socialist thinking leader. So that was, and we wanted to put the young people who are going to watch this film, who are going to have a debate with their parents, hopefully, right in the center of this moral compass. So that's why it's taken a long time to write and develop and to design, but also find a studio or a group of people, which we finally were incredibly lucky to join up with Anaventure, who really loved the project, who weren't going to find it tricky, or they didn't have reservations at all about the notion of making the film in the first place in this political climate.
That's awesome. I know that when I was watching the screening, the preview they sent us, I was thinking as a parent how much fun it was going to be to talk about these topics. My daughter is 4, she'll be at the screening, so
Oh,
I'm very
great.
interested to see what she takes from it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing with this book. You can read it when you're, like you were saying, Eli, when you're probably one of the first serious sort of young adult books that you read, and then you read it again when you're in your 30s, or you read it again in your 60s, and wow, it's eternally relevant, and it is multi-generational, and that was the desire behind making of the film in this way.
Back to what you were just talking about, and this character of Lucky, who you bring in as sort of a moral point of view character. One thing that I noticed was he's not just a witness. He's drawn towards power and has some benefits himself from being near it. Was this a deliberate choice to sort of shift the focus from why tyrants rise and why revolutions betray themselves to why ordinary individuals are tempted to align with them and before they fear them or realize that they're awful?
Absolutely, that's exactly what we wanted to do because we wanted a young audience to kind of go, look, if I was in this position, what would I do? How would I navigate this? Here's this clearly funny, charismatic leader who is offering me all of these benefits. I get to lie in a bed, I get to enjoy fast cars, I get to do all that, hang out with what he would think would be the cooler party. After originally setting out supporting what he believes was right for all animals. And this one of the central sort of metaphors we use is, and questions we ask is, are you an animal or are you a pig? So are you part of the broader or are you just looking after your own? And that is the question that later on he is actually asked by one of the other characters, Benjamin, the donkey, and that is really the center of it. What are we? Are we people who care about others, or are we really just out for ourselves? And that's I think that's why we created the character of Lucky, to be able to go on that journey where who wouldn't want those benefits? Who wouldn't want those, being feeling of a little bit of superiority? But as we know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so it's a route to nowhere, really, in terms of the beauty of what they set out to do, which was to create a world where everyone had equal say, everyone shared in the spoils of the farming that they've created together, and we seed that in, like in the book. In the very first chapter of the book, you know, they've begun to milk the cows and to take the apples from the orchard, and suddenly they disappear, and it's like, well, where have they gone? And they realize that in retrospect, oh well, the pigs needed them because they're the ones who are going to be leading us, and they're the ones who are going to be making decisions. So of course they need those, so that's really that was the beginning of Lucky, this character's journey. It was a journey to temptation, and then when the scales fall from his eyes, realizing he's backed the wrong leader.
So speaking about the point where the scales fell from his eyes, to sort of think counterfactually, did you see a point in the story, either as Orwell told it or you tell it, that the animals still could have corrected course? Is it once dissent becomes socially or personally risky? Is that when it becomes self-reinforcing? Is there another point at which the course could have been corrected?
That's a really great question. I mean, in this story, it's sort of it escalates and pardon the phrase, snowballs so quickly, that Lucky doesn't see it until it's too late. He moves away from his very best friend, who is Boxer. I mean, and that was the other thing. We created this relationship between Boxer, who obviously represents the hardest working animal, the working class kind of ethic, and staunch, believing in leadership, even though it's to his own detriment. And this is, Lucky and he are best friends, and then they go off on separate journeys, and that is so. To your point, that I think Lucky doesn't realize until it's way too late that he's made the wrong decisions, because his belief system has been subtly shifted into thinking that he is doing the right thing until they realize he's not.
Well, at our street, we talk a lot about institutions and the value of institutions and keeping them accountable. If you had to translate the lesson of Animal Farm into one principle for building institutions that don't decay in the way that theirs did, what would that be?
It is dignity and equality. Those are if I can use three words, that's the combination of those three.
Wonderful. Eli?
So one of our viewers here, Katie DePayne, pointed out the tension between the approachable animation style that you've selected and the underlying brutality and darkness of the material. In animation, and this is your second animated feature, I believe. You choose everything, what gets repeated, what fades, what starts to feel normal. How did working in the medium of animation change how you thought about power and the way it's curated, the way it works?
Well, as I say, that the whole reason that we chose an animated style versus a live action with realistic looking characters, and when I started making this, it was actually off the back of making the Planet of the Apes series of movies, where I played a character called Caesar, who in fact leads a rebellion from a facility to free all the apes from being incarcerated from a yes, from this facility where they're being experimented on. And that gave me the idea to make Animal Farm. That was the absolute moment back in 2000. I think it was 2012, or earlier, 2011 maybe. And I realized that animation, as I say, was a language that was becoming more acceptable for adults. It always as children we've spoken to, we've allowed stories and mythologies to come across in animation, and particularly obviously Disney, Pixar, who go into dark areas. Pixar were a company that we sort of completely felt aligned with, in the way that they start to talk about adult themes. If you look at the beginning of Up, famously, that is such a very dark opening to a film, but it's treated in such a way that you emotionally engage, even if you are at the age where you wouldn't understand what that scene that couple going through what they go through in that first 10 minutes of losing a child. You wouldn't understand that necessarily if you were a child, but you know something is hitting you emotionally. And that was our cue for that sort of level of pathos and true drama and stakes and consequence. And yes, we don't have. We held off the graphic violence that is mentioned in the book. So there are moments in the book where the animals are torn to pieces after the chickens rebel and refuse to sell their eggs, and they fly to the rafters, and then there's a sort of a kangaroo court, and they're executed, and they're literally torn to pieces in front of all of the other animals, and it's incredibly brutal. But we wanted to save that, but have implied threat, and turn that into the way that we're now seeing. We've become desensitized to violence in a way now, because it's we can watch it on the news 24 hours a day, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. So it's much more, we felt, important to convey the implied violence to kids, where they could sense that as Snowball is escorted from the farm, we don't see her being ripped to shreds by the dogs, but we know that something not great is going to happen. And then with what happens to Boxer later on in the movie, it's more to do with a great sadness, rather than, and that's about as dark as where it goes, is what happens to Boxer. But we definitely, in this day and age, it's the MPAA being what it is in terms of ratings and so on and so forth. But more importantly, your 4-year-old, Addison, who's going to sit and watch this movie, we didn't want to subject to. We went down the route of exploring that, but we didn't want to subject to that level of violence graphically on screen, but have it more as an overhanging promise of threat.
Thank you, by the way. Did you have any kind of North Star projects? You mentioned Up, that you were looking at when you were putting together the tone and how you wanted this to feel.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of animation, I think Up was a very good, is a very good comp in that respect. There's so many adult themes in Up, and just the way generally that Pixar approach, but without a Pixar budget, sadly, we didn't have that. But Anaventure were fully, we really examined how we wanted to present. But in terms of the visuals and the way it looked, what I wanted to do as a director was to create an animation that felt like, and this is by choice of camera shots and the design and the lighting. It was to feel like a live action film. So all our references were, Days of Heaven, Terrence Malick's film, many other, Witness, the Amish community in Witness and the building of the barn in that film, but the lighting and the design of the characters, I wanted to feel real. So they all have physical reality. They're not stretch and squeeze cartoons. The camera shots are never anything that a camera couldn't achieve. And crucially, there are lots of close-ups in this movie because I wanted to see inside the animals' heads rather than have it demonstrated in a pantomimic way. And all of these decisions go to creating a visual style, which is, I think it, again, it's being emotionally truthful and engaging to an audience, plus having the humor and entertaining so you can enjoy it on that level. But crucially, I wanted this to feel like a live action film shot in an animated style.
That's great.
Got it. So, one of the things that I find unsettling about the book and that it's very unsettling about Animal Farm generally is that propaganda works not just because it deceives, but because it comforts people too. How did you think about making the pig's language feel useful and even productive before it becomes very obviously sinister and destructive?
Well, I mean, Snowball works tirelessly for the benefit of all of the other animals. In her head, in our case, it's played by Laverne Cox. So Snowball's played by Laverne Cox. So she is someone who sets out absolutely concretely with a set of rules that should be adhered to. And those are the commandments that are laid out on the grain silo in our case. And that is what everyone agrees to, and the agreement is that if they don't abide by those rules, then they must leave Animal Farm. And so those are very clear objectives that she lays out. However, one of the rules, which is an unspoken rule, well, it's mentioned between them all, but is that they should never go into the farmhouse or have anything to do with trading with outsiders or using human luxuries in any way. But she sees herself as being above that because she goes into the farmhouse to get a book which will enable them to build a water mill. So that is an example of breaching a rule that should have been, held by everyone. However, she's breaking that rule in order to benefit everyone. So that is where it starts. That's where the fracturing starts. Is you start to override a specific set of decisions and laws that are created for the benefit of all, and you see yourself above that. And then if you do that incrementally and gradually, you start to break away from those rules. And that's an example of a breach, a breach of what is commonly agreed, and therefore, and also the fact that not listening and actually just talking. That though very basically, this film is very much about that. It's those who have the ability to speak and those who lose their voice, and so with those two things in mind, that's how we see it creep from being something that everyone shares to only the few who are given privileges.
So, one of the central tensions in the film is whether collapse and betrayal of values um, that are good and make sense come from bad leaders or from weak constraints. In your version, as you think about it, which do you think really breaks first, the character of the pigs or the mechanisms that might have held them accountable?
Well, that's a really great question. I think it's a combination of both, and I think it's without dodging what you're saying. I think it's one is sort of essentially one follows another, and I think Napoleon. There's always a sense of the character of Napoleon is there's always a darkness in that character. He is someone who would generally look out for himself before anybody else. He's a coward for a start, and he did, which is why he wants to surround himself with people or animals in this case, who are going to always follow his orders. So the young puppies who become his guard dogs later on, they are essentially. He feels better and stronger for having people under him, and he knows at some point may come in use for him. So that is obviously a character trait which we've seen with many leaders, despots, across the world throughout history. The galvanizing of power to enact your particular goals. So, and then you have a character like Snowball who does, I believe, set out to do the right thing. However, the pigs are already ahead of the game because they lay out the rules because they believe that they're the more intelligent species. So as long as there is this intellectual elite without the ability to listen to the rest of the animals and to differentiate themselves very early on, because even prior to the rebellion in the book, they've already begun to separate themselves. So we don't say that in our film. We allow them to feel a little more that they were all in this together, which is why the beginning of our movie is less of, well, it is a rebellion because they want freedom, but it comes out of a situation where they're all about to be, the farm has fallen into disrepair, benign neglect of this drunken farmer, and they're about to be taken. We start our film in a slightly different way to the book, but it still represents the same thing, but it incites their rebellion. But it's literally about freedom, about a fight for freedom, where they're about to be taken away and got rid of. But very quickly, I mean, in the book, and that is, I'm not saying that we align ourselves totally to the book. It's an adaptation, and any adaptation of any novel always will cause upset for people who are passionate about the book or have read it 100 times, or like you, Eli, and I've read it many, many times, and you have to make decisions when you're making a film about how you navigate what is in the book and what you choose to focus on. I know that there has been criticism that we drift away from the absolute word and chapter of the book, but any film adaptation will and has to by definition, because you have to examine the story from a particular point of view. So, but anyway, back to your point. That is I think the core of our film is it's a combination of both character and principle and the breakdown of those two.
Awesome. You mentioned working to adapt the book. How did the process of working with the author's estate go, convincing them you're going to do their book justice and things like that?
Well, one of the first things we did when we decided to make the film was contact the Orwell estate and speak to them and say we want to make a film that really does connect with a modern audience and speaks to modern times. There have been two film adaptations previously, one in 1954 and one in 1990. One was the very famous animation, which is a lot darker than ours, I would say. And then a much darker animatronic Jim Henson style Hallmark film, live action. And they both have different points of view. But I think we approached this with when we finally started to adapt it, it was always going to be, and through talking to the Orwell estate, we always knew that we were not going to go back to totalitarian Russia, that we wanted to make it applicable to the way young people might think today, and the things that they could recognize, and the visual cues and audio cues that they see around them at all times, in order to have this debate. And the Orwell estate were very much behind that. I mean, obviously we're not bending the story completely out of shape, other than we have a third act and the book doesn't have a third act. It really ends at the end of the second act in a very dark and bleak place. And I wanted as a director and in the script writing, the screenwriting of the film, we wanted to leave the audience with the idea that, yes, it's gone wrong again, but we have to keep trying. And there is a moment of optimism in our what is our third act really, which is how they get through it and reassemble to have another go at what will be the same task, which is going round the wheel again and how can we make it better this time?
Wonderful. We really appreciate your time. I want to give Eli a second to ask another question or two. I know we're a little bit over.
So I guess the last question I always like to ask in interviews is there anything we should have asked you about but haven't?
Um, that's a very good question. Well, I think the question might be something to do with is this a faithful adaptation of the book, or and is it to one of the things we were sort of accused of by studios when we were taking it around is that this book is very sort of messagey and spinachy is the word that was used. That the morals will hit you over the head really hard. So I suppose the question might be, why have you chosen to make it an entertaining film? And that goes to the heart of again of the design, the way we approached it, the way that I worked with animators to go inside the heads of the characters in a filmic way, and rather than demonstrate to the audience what they're thinking and feeling. We actually there are more close-ups in this film than most animations, and it is because you want to see what they're thinking. You want the audience to go into their headspace. So I think that is you know the tone and the basically that how we choose to examine our characters is not through just a dark messagey beating the audience over the head with a message film. It is being an entertainment and through entertainment educating and creating a debate.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're at time, so thank you so much for your time. This has
Not
been
at
a
all.
real pleasure, and we look forward to doing the screening.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody in the audience too who have you know have given such great questions. They really are thought provoking and exactly the sorts of questions I'm sure Orwell would want asked.
We'll let you know how the audience likes it, especially Eleanor.
Thank you. Yes, please do. Please do.
All right,
Take care.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.